afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Broadcasting Scotland. Today we are joined by Anne McLaughlin, MP for Glasgow North East, and Anthony Salamone, the Managing Director of European Merchants. Good afternoon, welcome.
Thank you. Afternoon.
And just to start with a coronavirus update, the status as of 2 p.m. on Saturday is that 5,858 new confirmed cases of COVID-19. There are 8 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. There are 4,098,078 people have received their first dose of the vaccine, and 3,640,865 have received their second dose. 494 people were in hospital with recently confirmed COVID-19, 49 of whom are in intensive care. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 413,515 people in Scotland have tested positive, while 8,111 patients who tested positive have sadly died. Our first story tonight this afternoon, is about Afghanistan. As evacuation flights are coming to a close, it emerges that many Afghans who aided the UK efforts there have been left behind. And it has emerged that for those who are present in the UK, there's been a block on decisions on asylum claims. This decision was not published and was only discovered by a lawyer of a man who is in the UK since he was 14, while he was trying to upgrade from humanitarian to refugee status. In the year ending in June 2021, 45% of Afghan asylum claims were rejected. New guidance has not yet been issued, despite the growing crisis. And as an MP for Glasgow North East, how has this affected your constituents and your work with the Westminster government?
Just to start by saying that as soon as it became clear that this was all going to happen in the way that it was never supposed to happen, i.e. the Americans and the rest of the Allies were pulling out this quickly and with the lack of preparedness, I called for everyone who is an Afghan asylum seeker, unless, as many people as possible, to expedite their asylum cases. You know that asylum seekers can wait years and years to be told whether or not they're going to be able to stay. So I've got so many Afghan constituents who right now are absolutely terrified that they're going to be sent back to Afghanistan. It's highly unlikely, but they need the peace of mind to know that they're not going to be sent back. But yeah, if you're asking me specifically about that, but the whole situation in Afghanistan has been extremely distressing for everybody involved in it. And this was not what was supposed to happen. It's also not what we were told in briefings. My understanding was that the flight, I say to my constituents when I get back to them and they tell me that their families haven't been able to get here, get out of Afghanistan.
Thank you, Anne. It has also emerged that there have been 5,000 emails that have been sent to the Foreign Office that have not been so much as read, and these include emails from MPs, from Labour leader Keir Starmer. Has this affected cases that you've been trying to raise?
So every case that we sent, we copied in what's known as the PPS, the Private Parliamentary Secretary, to whichever department it was, whether it was the Foreign Office we were talking to or the Home Office. That's what we were told to do. And every single case that we sent, when we copied them in, we got replies, and it would be replies addressed specifically to us, not just a kind of copy and paste, although undoubtedly a copy and paste, but dear Anne or dear whichever of my caseworkers sent it, acknowledging that they'd received it and read it and would action it. But I did wonder to myself, and I'm not sure if there's evidence that 5,000 haven't been read, but I did wonder to myself, are we getting these replies to give us false reassurance that something is being done, because it works. You get it back and you think, okay, that particular MP understands and knows and is in that department and is telling us that it's being looked at, and it does make you think, okay, I'll move on to the next one, and you feel somewhat reassured. And I wondered at the time, are they doing that to keep us quiet? And if I find out that any of mine were not read and not even considered, well, if I find out, what am I going to do? What can you do to this government? But I'll be extremely angry. And again, I don't know how I'm going to tell my constituents that, because I've got some very desperate people in this constituency. I've heard some terrible, terrible tales, and yeah, it's just awful.
Thank you. And as the evacuation flights are coming to a close, this also means that routes out of Afghanistan have been reduced for people trying to seek safety. Meanwhile, many people who did work with the UK government and the sort of other efforts there have been left behind with no safe route out. With the Nationality and Borders Bill, that has made it, well, will make it illegal to enter the UK by less than official means, which has been called out by the UNHCR, the refugee agency, as a violation of the 1951 Refugee Convention. I know there's not much we can do from a Scottish perspective about what's happening in Westminster, but would you like to comment about what this means for Afghans trying to seek safety?
Yeah, I certainly would. I think actually, in some ways, what's happening in Afghanistan right now gives us an opportunity to get that message across about this vile piece of legislation that's coming up, the Nationality and Borders Bill, as you mentioned, because we've got a live situation where, and I do feel the more public support, the more public genuine anger and outrage there is against this bill from people who previously didn't understand the impact of it, the more likely it is that we can get it changed or stopped. I mean, we're calling for it to be scrapped completely. I'm about to, in a couple of weeks, with my colleague Stuart MacDonald, be on the bill committee, and we will be examining every line. But the reason I think what's happening in Afghanistan can help to shine a light on this is because, as you rightly said, we have people who assisted the UK, and in doing so put their lives and their families' lives in danger, and we have left them there. So they couldn't come here on the official route. So now what they're going to have to do is hope and pray that they can get to another country where hope and pray that the UK has set up something that where they can apply to come here, and hope and pray that they say yes. Now, they've set nothing up that I'm aware of. They've certainly not told us of anything they've set up yet. So as of today, there are no official routes. And even when there were official routes, very few people managed to get on them. This bill says unless you come on an official route, you will be classed as a criminal. So, for instance, any of those people, and we all see them on television, it would take a very hard heart to look at those people who were our allies and say to them, stay there, let your lives be in danger. So you look at them, and I'm telling you, if those people can somehow escape, and those people can go on these treacherous journeys where they end up here and they manage to get themselves here, we are going to be saying to them, sorry, criminal, you won't even be considered. So I think it gives us the opportunity to shine a light on what they're doing. And I really hope that it leads to a massive campaign against the Nationality and Borders Bill. And there is a big campaign against it. I'd like people across the UK, even if you're not interested in politics, even if this is not something you ever want to be involved in, just this once, fight this piece of legislation, because what we're doing is absolutely cruel.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Anne. And of course, it isn't just people who have aided the UK that we should be concerned about, but also Rainbow Railroad, an organization that supports LGBTQ refugees, is also calling on the UK government to act on their list of LGBTQ Afghans who are in extreme danger from the Taliban at this moment as well. And it's just another issue with the Nationality and Borders Bill. that would
Yeah.
also make it difficult for them to seek
Absolutely.
safety.
Yeah. And women, we have, multiple lists of women who had the temerity to become journalists, had the temerity to speak up for themselves, had the temerity to study, and they will be punished for that. And I'm hearing from people who are hiding, they're hiding in basements there. They've not eaten. They're sending me photographs of their children. And they've, yes, you're right, that's a whole category of people who had nothing to do with the Allies. They were just getting on with their lives, but because of the fact that they are women, because of the fact they don't support the Taliban, they're in danger. And so many LGBT, I would not wish to be LGBTQ in Afghanistan with the Taliban taking over. This, there's just so many layers of horrendousness on all of this.
Thank you. Moving on to our next story, despite the ongoing economic hardship due to the pandemic, the universal credit is set to be cut by £20 a week from the 6th of October. This is a reduction of the increase that was brought in during the coronavirus pandemic. Glasgow will be one of the hardest hit areas and the hardest hit area in Scotland, with more than 40% of children in each Westminster constituency in Glasgow set to be hit by the cut. This ranges from 43% in Glasgow North to 63% in Glasgow Central. And apart from the impact on children, this has also been criticised on economic grounds, as it will reduce spending power from 5 million households across the UK. And as the MP for Glasgow North East, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I'm sickened by it. So 54% of families with children in my constituency are going to be impacted by this. Now, I put something on Facebook about this, and I had a couple of people coming back to me talking of hard hearts. A couple of people coming back and saying, yes, but they knew it was temporary. Yes, but they knew it wasn't going to last forever. It was extra money they were given. But do you know what? It wasn't extra money. All that extra £20 a week did was bring the, I don't like calling them benefits, but the payments in line with inflation, because they've been cut year after year. So this just brought it up in line with inflation. People, who were struggling before, allowed them to just breathe a little, not a lot, just a little. And when you get used to being able to breathe a little, it's extremely hard to go back. But because of something else I think we're going to be talking about later, the food shortages, there's going to be an increase in food prices. We've seen that the hold on energy prices has been allowed to lapse. So there's an increase in energy prices. So people's outgoings are going up and their income is to come down again. And it's not right. And it's just, another example of the shocking way in which the Tory government treats people. And, I had put something out this week because I was absolutely horrified when I discovered that the Chancellor, who's making this decision, Rishi Sunak, is currently getting a swimming pool and tennis courts put into one of his homes. I mean, I don't begrudge anybody a swimming pool if they can afford it, but don't be giving yourself a swimming pool when at the same time you're personally making the decision that you're going to plunge people already living in dire straits into even deeper dire straits.
Thank you. And of course, the Scottish Government has introduced the Scottish Child Payment, which is £10 a week for each child. And this is set to be increased to £20. But if this is coming online at the same time that people are seeing a reduction in their universal credit, does this sort of leave what is meant to be a program to help improve the lives of the most sort of economically disadvantaged children, just another time that Holyrood has been left sort of trying to mitigate the impacts of Westminster's austerity as opposed to being able to get on with improving things for ourselves?
Yeah, which is, it's why we need independence. It's why we must have the powers over this, because what is the point? To be able to do the Scottish Child Payment, which is fantastic, and it's been hailed by anti-poverty charities as one of the best things that that could have been done. But what's the point if then it's taken away? What we give in one hand is taken away, and that money that our Scottish Government has allocated for that has had to come out of something else because our budget is finite, because we're not independent and we have to stick to the budget that is given to us. So, it just, this continually mitigating, we have to do it because you cannot turn your back on people. But it's galling. It's absolutely galling that that will then be taken away from those people that are on universal credit. And yeah, as I said, just yet another one of the multiple arguments for independence. And it's why I think people who didn't previously understand that are really getting to see now why, independence is not a lofty ambition, it's an essential really for Scotland.
Thank you. And on to our next story. There have been labor shortages across the UK supply chain that have been leading to shortages of food in supermarkets. Have been leading to difficulty in maintaining supplies. And we have Anthony Salamone here today, who's the managing director of European Merchants. I was wondering if you'd like to speak to us about the impact of this on the food and drink industry in Scotland.
Sure. Well, so the disruption that we're currently seeing, really has two core roots. One, of course, is Brexit generally, but particularly the new relationship or the relationship we're coming accustomed to with the trade and cooperation agreement between the UK and the EU. And the other, of course, is the coronavirus pandemic. They both had an impact. It's important to recognize that. But as I wrote in the National this past week, I think most people in industry would agree that Brexit is the structural change, the permanent change to not just the economy but to a wider society. And the pandemic, well, of course, has been very acute and damaging in particular respects, is something which we're very grateful to know is temporary. So yes, why? Well, the Brexit agreement, of course, is a minimal deal in terms of economics and trade, but also in many other areas. So the trade between the UK and the EU is limited and restricted. So, for instance, on goods, which of course, and that's been one of the shortages reported of late across restaurants and supermarkets and other retailers, there's much more bureaucracy now for trade between the UK and the EU. While the trade and cooperation agreement provides for zero tariffs and zero quotas, you still need customs forms, even if you're putting, there's zero to pay on it. And that has created difficulties. But perhaps more significantly, and certainly in the case of Scotland, is the changes to immigration policy. So the UK no longer, and Scotland no longer being part of the free movement of people, means that EU citizens can only live or work or study here if they have a visa to do so, which of course is a dramatic change from what we had before. And obviously the pandemic has, with all the various restrictions we've gone through, has had their impact as well. So, significant changes. And Brexit is a profound structural change to the nature of the state and to the economy. And regrettably, those are intentional choices by the successive UK governments, from Theresa May through to Boris Johnson, deciding to leave the single market, deciding to have a minimal relationship with the EU, and as we've touched on earlier, to have a restrictive immigration policy. Those are all intentional policy choices which have significant effects, and I'm afraid they'll continue for some time.
Thank you. We've seen stories that the Scottish food and drink industry organizations are calling for a 12-month COVID recovery visa to allow employers to expand recruitment both in the EU and globally. Is that something you think would help?
It could well help. Businesses are usually quite canny in terms of their political engagement. So in this circumstance, in view of a government which is very committed to implementing a hard Brexit and to having a restrictive immigration policy, I suppose it would make sense for businesses to try to propose individual specific measures rather than try to argue for a broader change in policy if they feel that wasn't going to be successful. So yes, a one-off visa program may help alleviate some of the labor shortages that we've seen, but obviously that's not a long-term solution. And it's a question of what kind of conditions would be attached to those arrangements. For instance, would they be allowing people to come to the UK to work for a period of time, but on the expectation that was finite and that they would have to return wherever they came from? That might not be appealing to people, and also might not be particularly fair either. So yes, one-off visa arrangements that are introduced may help in the short term, but it doesn't really mitigate the longer-term implications of the intentional choice to have a distant relationship with the EU and a closed immigration policy compared to what we had before.
Yes, thank you. Reports have suggested that the UK has lost 1.3 million non-UK workers since the end of 2019. And that is obviously a significant chunk of the UK workforce. So it's hard to imagine a visa program replacing such a loss. Other reports have suggested that due to the workforce shortages, especially the shortage of drivers, leaves us at the risk of having empty shelves at Christmas. Is that something that you think is likely?
I think it's possible because both in respect of the Brexit deal, but also in terms of the pandemic, many of the consequences for consumers take longer to materialize. So, for instance, supply shortages aren't necessarily always a result of a dearth of particular materials that day or the day before or the week before. These things can be months and years in the making. So that's to say, a shortage at Christmas could be a consequence or a result of difficulties that we are having right now, for instance, or have had in previous months. So yes, and also because it's quite clear that the UK government, while they may potentially entertain one or two of these discrete visa programs, is very intent on pursuing these policies of not approaching anything near to the free movement of people within the EU, and focusing only on high wage, so-called high skill jobs in terms of visas and so on, except for the specific small programs that they have decided to allocate. So yes, it's perfectly possible, as I said previously, that this disruption will continue and could be into Christmas and indeed beyond that. I think businesses will try to, as they always do, adjust as much as they can to rationalize their products to sort of make their shelves look fuller than they might otherwise be. But yeah, challenges ahead, I'm sure.
Yes, and of course, when we talk about the loss of 1.3 million workers, there's the impact on the economy, but there's also the impact if that is 1.3 million people who used to live here who no longer do. That's a loss to communities, to their friends, to their families. And that's something that should always be remembered, that it isn't just economic impacts. And as an MP, as we've been sort of discussing things that the UK government could and couldn't do to address the loss of the workforce, do you have any sort of thoughts on what might be possible within the current environment?
Yeah, well, so my colleague Deirdre Brock, one of the Edinburgh MPs, and she's the spokesperson. She's spokesperson for food, but many other things. But I know she certainly deals with the food shortages. She has called several times for the UK government to add, for instance, HGV drivers to the UK shortage occupation list. But I think Anthony's absolutely, made the point that short-term measures are not the whole answer. And it just underlines once again that if this Tory government hadn't dragged Scotland out of the EU against our will, against our very clearly stated will in the EU referendum in the first place, and if Scotland had had the full powers of independence, we would not be facing these issues. You're not seeing massive food shortages across Europe, although the UK government would have you believe this has nothing to do with Brexit and everything to do with the pandemic, but it can't be, or you'll be seeing it across Europe. So again, it's just, I'll never apologise for banging on about independence, because it's the only way to build a better relationship with Europe, to have free movement of people, and to get a better recovery for Scotland from the pandemic, but also solutions to this issue that has been brought about by Brexit.
And that is actually a point to raise as well, is our recovery from the pandemic. Both in terms of our previous story with the universal credit cut, reducing the spending power of 5 million families in the UK, and in terms of being having labor shortages that are impacting our supply chain and thus our ability to engage with the economy. How do we see this affecting our affecting our recovery from the pandemic, like the economic impact of the pandemic? Anthony?
From the Brexit arrangements that we have now, do you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. So so I think it's clear that we're in a sort of, it may be temporary, but we seem to be in a nascent recovery phase. well, certainly at least it's a function of the reductions in restrictions that we've seen over the spring and summer. But I think that sort of nascent economic recovery or revival is certainly threatened by the kinds of shortages that we've been talking about, which in the main are a function of the distant relationship between the EU and the UK that we have now. So that's one way of saying that, a hard Brexit will make our economic recovery, more difficult. And I suppose, as Anne mentioned, if you look at other European countries, which is always a useful point of comparison, and compare them to how the UK is doing, then you might see that that they may be doing better in some respects than we are. And again, that comes back to the point that these are intentional policy choices to have that kind of distant relationship. I think the EU, of course, would have been willing to negotiate a closer relationship with the UK in exchange for aligning with EU principles and policies, which the UK government wasn't willing to do. So I think if we look to the long term, there's a lot of uncertainty in economic respects and also other ones. But this distant relationship, I think we're still adjusting to that, and it's going to take time for some businesses to start to see the full consequences, not least as some of the grace periods are expiring or will expire in the future. And also, once the pandemic is whenever it is thankfully fully behind us, we will see that some of the things which the pandemic may have masked, some of the effects of Brexit that may have been masked by the pandemic, that sort of veneer will be gone, and we will see the full impacts of Brexit.
Thank you. In terms of the labor shortages as well, there's been some talk in the media about using incarcerated people as a labor pool for things like the meat industry. And I was wondering, as a legislator, do you have any comments about the use of incarcerated people as a labor pool?
So my comments are that I think there's also a call for people who are released from prison to be considered more than they have been for the employment market. So I would certainly support that, because how else do you expect people who come out of prison to rehabilitate themselves, if you like? And let's not forget, a lot of people coming out of prison are in prison in the first place because of an illness, either a mental illness or an addiction. So I certainly support, I think it's, I hope I'm right in saying it's Timson's, the chair of Timson's, who has always done this and is calling on other people to do it. If you're talking about using people currently in prison as forced labour, then no, I absolutely wouldn't support that. Not at all. Is that what you're talking about?
There's been media discussion about use of prisoners as opposed to people leaving prison, but obviously, yes, people leaving prison, that's very important to consider. They're often immediately discounted from the labor pool, which obviously shouldn't happen.
Yeah.
Right. So in terms of Brexit discussions, there's also a polling emerging suggesting that in the wake of Brexit, 2/3 of people in Northern Ireland say that there should be a border poll. However, only 37% want it in the next 5 years. And at present, there is a 7-point lead in polling for remaining in the UK. So in the case of Northern Ireland, they're obligated to have a border poll if over 50% of people support reunification, but that doesn't seem to be the case at the moment. Anne, as a UK legislator, would you like to comment?
So I just think, what is this? It's democracy. That's all it is. If people, if there's a question within a nation that needs to be answered and it can't be resolved, and the question of a border poll cannot be resolved other than by having one, then have it. What is there to be afraid of? If 2/3 of people are saying that they want a poll, well, it's their country. Allow them to have a poll. But it's kind of very similar to for different reasons to the situation in Scotland, where the UK government tries to deny democracy in Scotland. And they say, well, we're not going to have an independence, we're not going to have a Section 30 order because the people of Scotland don't want independence. Well, if you're so sure about it, go ahead and test it. But the reason that they won't go ahead and test it is because they're not that sure. But yeah, I just think, why be afraid of democracy? Especially the British government that refers to itself as the bastion of democracy throughout the world. I mean, I don't agree with that description, but they do. So, put your money where your mouth is.
Thank you. Anthony, I wonder if you'd like to comment from the perspective of the trade arrangements in Northern Ireland at present, where they are more connected to Ireland, and the Northern Ireland Protocol seems to have prevented them having the same sort of supply issues we've had.
Sure, yeah, and I'd also like to touch on the broader point, if that's all right. So in
Yes,
respect
absolutely.
of the trade aspect, thank you. In respect to the trade aspects, yes, I think it's clear that although the unionist community, of course, do not support this, that the arrangement for Northern Ireland is facilitating deeper economic integration between Northern Ireland and Ireland. That is to say that, as a consequence of the more remote trading relationships between the Great Britain, I suppose, in this case, rather than just the UK, and the European Union, that it is easier for traders in Northern Ireland to trade, in replacement, in some respects, with Ireland and with the European Union. So there is, a sort of all-island integration, if you like, more from what already existed. In terms of the broader politics, I think that it would be prudent for the UK government to approach the Northern Ireland question, if you want to call it that, in a similar way that I wish that they would approach the Scottish one, which is to say that the UK government, is the government of the state, but they have an obligation when acting in respect of a particular part of that state to listen to the people and the politics there. So whether that be in a Northern Ireland border poll or a Scottish independence referendum, the UK government should feels it wants, it should be guided by what the people there in those particular places say that they want. Now, it's more complicated, obviously, in Northern Ireland context because of the history, not least because there is another state involved in Ireland, and there, it will depend on public opinion in Ireland as well, and I mean the Republic, of course, on whether or not they would want to see the reunification happen. And of course, there was always the presumption that would be the case, but I think that there is certainly a minority constituency, which I'm not sure how large it is within Ireland, that look at the prospect of reunification in the medium term, and frankly, they see costs, economic costs associated with that, which may dampen their enthusiasm for it. So certainly the issue is not going to go away, but it's a complicated picture, and I wouldn't imagine seeing a Northern Ireland border poll in the near future.
Thank you. So our next story is a pretty big one. So the Green Party and the Scottish Green Party and the SNP membership have both approved the cooperation deal at Holyrood. And this deal involves commitments across a number of areas to work together. It's still, I believe, yet to be fully ratified, but it looks like it's headed that way. Anne is an SNP MP, not at Holyrood, but with the SNP. Would you like to comment on the deal broadly?
Yeah, I'm absolutely delighted. I was so excited because there are so many things that we have in common. But maybe the SNP takes some things a little further than the Greens, and the Greens take other things a little further than the SNP, but we've so much in common. I worked in the 2014 referendum, which of course we were actively campaigning on for 2 years, so it was more than just 2014. But I worked with a number of Green Party members and a number of the activists that I worked with. As you know, loads of people joined the SNP the day after the referendum, but but a number of them joined the Greens. And, we've always collaborated. So anything that encourages consensus and cooperation, and anything that means that we are guaranteed to be able to go ahead, well, guaranteed from our perspective, the Scottish Parliament perspective, to get the referendum legislation through that allows us to have one, is good in my view. So I think it's absolutely fantastic. And also the fact that I think it was 94.9% of SNP members voted in favour of it. I mean, I'm not the slightest bit surprised by that, and it's not quite finished being counted yet, but 89% of Scottish Green members. I'm not at all surprised. I'm just absolutely thrilled and looking forward to our parties finding the way forward in the Scottish Parliament, because it's not going to be. I'm sure it won't be without its challenges, but it'll be really interesting. It's a new way of politics in Scotland, and fantastic.
Anthony, do you have any comments about the deal broadly before we look at the specifics?
Yes, indeed. And I wrote a Twitter thread about the cooperation agreement when it was published. But as I mentioned in that thread, I think it's important to recognize this is an unusual arrangement. It is a hybrid deal between a coalition government, which this is not, and a confidence and supply arrangement in which the Greens would agree to support the SNP on budget votes and votes of confidence in exchange for a shared agenda. This is a hybrid arrangement in which the Greens will not be joining the Scottish Government or part of the Scottish Government, but they will have ministers in the government. That is odd. I know that there's the comparison with New Zealand, which is fine and interesting. Obviously, Scotland is a European country, so it makes sense to look at other countries that Europe are doing. And I can't think of any particular example, certainly where parliamentarians serve as ministers, or this has happened before in Europe, and that's probably because it's odd to have a party which is in government but not in government. I think that's a confused picture, and it will probably create some challenges. And frankly, it probably would have been simpler for us all if the SNP and Greens had either gone into a formal coalition or had done a confidence and supply arrangement.
And what do you have to say to the potential oddness of the arrangement?
So, on the other hand, you could look at it as, leading the way with a very different way of doing politics. And, there's nothing that says you have to go with what others have done in other countries. They've clearly looked at it and found a way that works for them. And I just, as I said, it won't be without its challenges. I think it would be really interesting. And maybe one day other countries will be looking at how Scotland did it and finding that actually it does work.
So it is a different kind of arrangement, which reflects, I think, the way our parliament works. And I mean, personally, I think the level of cooperation looks really interesting, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how it works out. Anthony, do you have any specific things from the cooperation agreement that stood out to you as either something that was interesting or something you're looking forward to seeing?
So, in terms of what's interesting, in terms of the exclusions on the list, being an expert on foreign policy, I found it quite interesting, if not revelatory, that the international relations in a broad brush sense, except for what's specifically in the agreement, is excluded. Now, obviously, NATO is specifically mentioned. Of course, the SNP and Greens disagree on NATO. But I would be interested to know, and I think it would be great for us to all know, what are the, ostensible profound differences between the SNP and Greens that international relations had to be excluded from the deal. I don't know what those are, and I would really like to know, because I think that would be an important point of difference between them. In terms of the sort of policy agenda, if you like, that was attached to the agreement, I think what's interesting is how detailed it is in many of the areas which the SNP and Greens aim to work together. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why it took so long, because of course it was rather odd that the negotiations took as long as they did. But I suppose if they were trying to go into that amount of detail in terms of all the areas that are covered, I suppose that makes sense. And of course, this agreement, can work well for both the parties in some ways, and perhaps less so in others. For the SNP, they have the advantage of locking in Green support in advance for confidence votes and the budget, which obviously would be a big relief to them. They also, we could talk about the independence aspect of it, but I think that this agreement doesn't really do much on that in terms of making the case for trying to get the UK government to agree on a referendum. But it means they have their ministers, even though they're not formally in the government per se in terms of the party. But in terms of cons, it's very clear that opposition parties see the Green Party as the weaker link, and will try their best, as they're already doing, particularly the Conservatives, to associate Green positions with the SNP, even if those aren't actual SNP positions. And I imagine we'll see a lot more of that in the future. And also for the Greens, if they were in either of the circumstances, they could have more influence. So if you're in a full coalition, smaller parties would generally have a disproportionate degree of influence depending on the dynamics. Obviously, each case is different. And if you're in confidence and supply, you can barter on an issue-by-issue basis, which would normally give you more leverage if the SNP minority government were in a tight spot. In this arrangement, they have sort of compromised and traded that upfront influence and hope to, over the course of this agenda, achieve more. It's hard to know whether or not that will actually happen. The party is so small that, when it comes to major decisions, of course, while they could always walk away, the SNP may just get its way anyway. So, I think we'll see how this works out, but it's hard to say.
Thank you. And do you have a response to any of those points, or any issue or any specific issues in the cooperation agreement that stand out to you as things that you're really excited about or have questions about?
Well, I was just going to say the things that I'm really looking forward to seeing more about is the investment in active travel and public transport, and this idea of having a fair fares review. I think will be very, very interesting. There are major problems with public transport in Glasgow anyway, and there are solutions out there, and I'm interested in that. But I'm also really interested in the affordable homes issue. I think the SNP has done pretty well on affordable homes and house building, but tenants' rights do need to be strengthened because they're not always being met. And we have, in my constituency, we're doing a focus on some of the things impacting on tenants and their lives, because if you don't have a secure tenancy, you don't have a secure home, then what it really impacts on every aspect of your life. So I'm really interested in that. As I say, I think what the Greens are doing is pushing us a little further in the direction that we're going in anyway. And I think what Anthony said about if they had a proper coalition, they would have disproportionate influence. I think the Greens and the SNP are Democrats and recognise that you shouldn't have a disproportionate say in what happens, and that's possibly why we haven't got a coalition and why we've got what we've got. But I think it'll be interesting to let's come back maybe in a year's time, as I'm sure they will do as well, and review how well it's working and how it can be improved or enhanced.
Yes, thank you. So this deal has commitments in a lot of areas, though, as Anthony has pointed out, there are a lot of areas that are also excluded. What do you think about some of those exclusions, Anne? Even particularly on, so there's some on foreign policy, there's some on social issues.
Yeah, I think there are some exclusions and there are some things that are not mentioned because we already agree on them and agree on the extent of them. I think, I think it's a good, a positive way of doing things that allows the Greens to say, okay, to openly say we do not agree with the SNP government on this. So we're not in coalition, and we don't want to stop the Green Party being the Green Party, and we don't want to stop being the SNP. So I think it's positive to have the exclusions and to be able to just say exactly what you think, and for them to be able to challenge the SNP government on things that they don't agree with. And I think Anthony said there will be times when, the Tories in particular, but sections of the media will be questioning the SNP on something the Greens are proposing that we don't agree with, and this just allows us all to be very clear about the things that we don't agree on.
Thank you, Anne. Anthony, do you have any follow-up to that?
Yes, I think it would be interesting to see how this plays out with the public, because it's clear that the Conservatives are already making these kinds of attacks in respect of the oil and gas industry, on roads and buildings and maintenance of them, on the use of GDP and the importance or not of economic growth. And to be frank, I suppose we'll have to see some research on this, but I imagine that those kinds of associations between the SNP and Greens may have some traction with voters, so sort of middle of the road voters or undecided voters. I don't mean the party faithful, because it's on the one hand, you might say the Green Party is at risk of losing its identity as the smaller party in this cooperation agreement that is not a coalition, because if you've got two ministers in the government, even if you've got an official deal that says on some areas we agree and some areas we don't, if a government does something and you're a minister in the government, it's likely, if not probable, that the public as a whole, generally speaking, will associate you with that policy or that decision, regardless of the fact that you can say, this has nothing to do with us, even though we're a member of this government. But at the same time, the SNP also face a similar risk in that sense, that if they become associated with the positions or the decisions or what have you of the smaller party, it's a strange reversal, but I think it could be the case because, generally speaking, I imagine most of the public won't appreciate these fine line differences between it's not an actual coalition, we agree on some things and don't agree on other things. One of the reasons why most parties either do a coalition or conference and supplies, because if you're going to go into a government together, which the Greens are half doing, yeah, it's hard. And of course, the political parties in a coalition don't agree on everything. That's why they're separate parties. But they do make an agreement and they do have a cohesive government together, rather than this middle road hybrid approach, which is to say on the things we can agree with, we'll agree, and the things we don't agree with, we disagree. We don't see that very often because that's not traditionally how politics works. You're either in or out. And I think what I find more interesting is, of course, the Greens in their support of independence also support a republic, as opposed to the SNP's position, whatever that is exactly, whether it's monarchy or just ambiguity. And I imagine that if we were a republic and we were independent, that the president, who obviously, depending on the constitution, would have a role in appointing ministers, would ask a lot of questions about this deal and perhaps may not even agree to it because of that oddity, not in terms of a shared agenda, but in terms of having ministers in the government when that party is not in the government, and the sort of a half in, half out when it comes to collective responsibility, which is rather odd.
And do you have a response to that?
No, I was just going to say that I agree, there are risks here. There's also the risk that we haven't mentioned that, a lot of Green voters vote SNP and vice versa. And might we be in danger of losing votes to the Greens because we have helped to highlight the positive things about the Green Party? But you know what? These are all risks that we've decided it's worth taking because we think this is a really positive way forward for Scotland. So we'll just have to take the risk and we'll just have to, see how it goes. But I think it's incredibly grown-up politics that both parties are showing to take those risks and just see what happens at the end of it.
Thank you. And of course, one of the reasons for having this agreement is to strengthen the case for independence, as we have a pro-independence majority, though, as Anthony's pointed out, there aren't a lot of specifics in the agreement about how we're going to pursue that. So what do we need to do to sort of clear the path towards independence, especially with comments in the media lately about things like, oh, we'll have a referendum, or we'll allow a referendum when 60% of the population supports it, which is, of course, anti-democratic. And do you have comments on that?
Yeah, well, we've got the 11-point plan that Michael Russell produced. We've already laid down legislation, laid the groundwork for the referendum through the Referendum Scotland Bill. Obviously, we want this to be as legally unchallengeable as possible. So at the moment, the Section 30 is still the way forward. But the fact that the UK government have come out with this ridiculous nonsense that, well, you'll have to have 60% in opinion polls consistently, I don't know what that means, don't know how long they mean for. The fact that they've done that, that's them moving from no to, well, okay, if the opinion polls say 60%. And the reason they're moving, it's because we in the SNP and other independent supporting parties and the people of Scotland are consistently saying, we're having this Section 30, you cannot deny us, because that is anti-democratic. And remember, Britain, you are the bastion of democracy. And the more consistently we push, the more they will move. And as I say, that's a huge leap to now be saying, well, okay, maybe if you get 60%, which of course is a nonsense. We shouldn't have to be doing that. That shouldn't be a barrier in the way. But it's a barrier which is different to the one that just simply says no.
Yes, absolutely. Anthony, do you want to comment?
Yeah, so in terms of the UK government's approach to this, and I wrote about this maybe a couple of weeks back, I think there are sort of three parts to the strategy which the UK government, since at least Theresa May, have employed. And as Anne mentioned and you mentioned, Aaron, we've seen evidence of that in terms of the 60% mark, which is to say the UK government says we get to decide whether or not a referendum happens. And of course, many people wouldn't agree with that. Second, they say we decide what basis we make that judgment on. And third is that we either change whatever that basis is or we won't tell you what it is. Now, as a matter of fact, they seem to have told us. But again, as Anne mentioned, there's no clarity on how long this opinion poll would have to be for, what type of opinion poll or what have you. So all of those arguments are unsustainable. But when it comes back to first this agreement between the SNP and Greens and the ongoing dispute between the Scottish and UK governments over whether a referendum should happen, of course, that is the core issue, that the two governments do not agree. I think I had certainly hoped, at least, that after the Holyrood election, we might have seen a change in position or a coming together or a desire to try to cooperate on this issue from the UK government side. And we haven't seen that. In response to the election result, we didn't see the same thing as last time after the 2011 Holyrood election, where the UK government said, very quickly after that vote, yes, we'll be going forward with agreeing that it makes sense to have an independence referendum. We saw no substantive change to the position of the UK government following this Holyrood election. Now, will this agreement change much between the SNP and Greens in respect of that dispute between the Scottish and UK governments? No, I don't think so, because I imagine if Boris Johnson was going to change his mind, it would have been after the election, not after this deal, because the two main arguments that the Scottish government would put forward to the UK government, I presume, would be there's a majority in the Scottish Parliament in favour of a referendum, and there was before this cooperation deal with the Greens. That doesn't change. Or we have a majority government, which obviously the SNP do not have on their own, and this does not create a coalition majority government. I suppose you could technically say it's sort of a majority government because you have two new ministers and so on, but that's not the point. And that leads me to my core argument, which is that this is not about legality. It's about politics. If we want to have a referendum where Scotland has the prospect of really becoming actually functionally independent, governments need to agree on having that referendum, how it works, and a commitment in advance to implementing its outcome. And then, of course, if the outcome was independence, working through all of the transformative work that would be required to turn Scotland into a state. So at the end of the day, this is not about who has the legal power over whatever. It's about the two governments needing to work together extremely closely from before a referendum until well after it. And of course, we are not in that space at the moment.
Thank you. We're just coming to the end of our time, but Anne, I wondered if you had a brief response to that.
No, just that. Yeah, I agree. We do have to be in a position where the strongest position will be if the two governments work closely together on it, each wanting different outcomes, of course, but as we did in 2014, and there is no moral or democratic justification for not doing that. And that's what, in Westminster, the SNP MPs, I've rarely heard an SNP MP speak about anything where they don't also make the case for independence and for that Section 30 order. And that's what we'll keep pushing for. And we've got plans for how we're going to push this along, but we're determined there will be a referendum. I expect it will be in the next couple of years. And of course, I'm absolutely certain we're going to win it when it happens.
Thank you. So that's our time for today, and that is our show for today. Thank you for joining us. And we here at Broadcasting Scotland need your help. We depend on your support. So if you could please follow the link below me on the screen and support us, we would appreciate that. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining me.